So, Prince William doesn't usually move this fast, and that's the first thing you need to understand about why this whole situation is so significant. We're not talking about a slow palace review that takes 6 months and ends with a carefully worded statement nobody reads twice. We're talking about a decision made within hours behind a closed door in Windsor, after his daughter Charlotte ended up shaking in a corridor. And the person on the receiving end of that decision wasn't some random courtier or distant cousin nobody's heard of. It was Camilla's granddaughter, Lady Amelia, who until that afternoon held an honorary palace role created specifically so she could appear at family events. The title's gone now. William stripped it, and the reason it happened so fast is because the fight between the girls wasn't really about the girls. It was about something an adult said weeks earlier that traveled through the household until it landed in the mouth of a teenager who had no business repeating it. Before we get into the timeline of how this all unraveled, take a second to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next update, greater than all right. Let's break down exactly what happened. So here's where the story gets complicated, because on the surface you have what looks like a physical altercation between two young women in a Windsor corridor. That's dramatic enough on its own. But what William discovered in the hour after he pulled his daughter aside is that Charlotte hadn't just been pushed. She'd been confronted with a very specific claim. Something Amelia repeated almost word for word about William supposedly wanting Camilla's entire side of the family pushed out of royal life once Charles is no longer king. Charlotte's response, according to the private recorded account that emerged later, was to say, "That isn't what my father said." And instead of that giving Amelia pause, instead of that moment of doubt stopping the confrontation, Amelia pushed her anyway. That's the detail that changed everything. Not the push itself, which was bad enough, but the fact that Amelia had a moment where she realized the information she was acting on might not be accurate, and she proceeded anyway. William read that account twice. He asked who gave Amelia those words. Nobody answered, and that silence did more damage than any confession could have. The setting matters here because this wasn't a random encounter. This was a planned Windsor weekend with Charles, Camilla, the Wales family, and selected relatives all under one roof. Amelia was there because of that honorary designation, the young royal companion clears throat role. Now, I need to explain what that actually means because the terminology gets confusing, and it's central to understanding why William had the authority to strip it so quickly. This wasn't a constitutional royal title. It wasn't a peerage. It wasn't something granted by the sovereign that required parliamentary involvement to remove. It was a ceremonial privilege created at palace discretion, essentially an invented role that allowed Amelia to appear at selected family events, stand in certain photographs, and participate in some of the ceremonial visibility that working royals do without actually being a working royal or having any constitutional function. Think of it like a guest pass that looks official but can be revoked by the people who issued it without any legal process whatsoever. That's important because when Camilla later challenged William's decision, she wasn't challenging something protected by law. She was challenging something that existed purely because the palace had chosen to create it. And William, as the future king controlling his own household ceremonial environment, had the practical authority to withdraw it when conduct crossed a line. Catherine's response in the immediate aftermath tells you a lot about how serious this was. She didn't minimize it. She didn't call it youthful temper and suggest everyone move on. She took Charlotte into a nearby room, closed the door, and made it very clear that protecting her daughter did not require turning Amelia into a public enemy. That distinction is so specific and so deliberate. She wasn't saying what happened didn't matter. She was saying the response had to be proportional and private, not retaliatory. Charlotte, for her part, was not feeling victorious. She admitted during that conversation with her mother that she had said something cruel during the argument, specifically that a borrowed palace title didn't make Amelia royal. Charlotte regretted it almost immediately, even before things turned physical. She expected anger from her mother. What she got instead was something harder. Catherine told her that defending herself was one thing, but allowing somebody else's bitterness to control her actions was another. That's not the kind of parenting that lets a child feel like a victim even when they were genuinely wronged. That's the kind of parenting that makes a child examine their own choices even when the other person started it. Now, while Catherine was having that conversation, William was already in his private office signing an internal removal order. He didn't consult Charles first. He didn't wait for a family review. He looked at what happened to his daughter, asked one quiet question about whether Amelia had put her hands on Charlotte first, and then acted. Camilla froze when she learned what he had done. Her position was that Amelia should have been corrected privately, not stripped of the designation and barred from ceremonial appearances involving Charlotte, George, or Louis. And honestly, if this had just been a fight between teenagers who said nasty things to each other, Camilla's argument might have carried more weight. But the documented account prepared by the senior aide changed the calculation entirely, because it revealed that Amelia hadn't just been lashing out with her own thoughts. She had repeated a deeply personal remark about Charlotte that she claimed to have heard from an adult connected to Camilla's household. That's the moment it stopped being about two girls who couldn't get along and started being about something much more troubling. William read the account and then asked the question that nobody wanted to answer: who had given Amelia those words? The silence that followed told him everything. He set his pen beside the signed order and said the fight was no longer the only problem. Someone had allowed adult resentment to travel downward, until two younger members of the family were carrying it. That's such a precise way to frame it, because it identifies the real issue. The fight in the corridor was the symptom. The disease was whatever had been said weeks earlier that made Amelia believe she had ammunition to use against Charlotte. So now we have to go backward, because the Windsor fight didn't actually begin at Windsor. It began 3 weeks earlier at a private family dinner at Clarence's house. And what happened around that table is where the real damage was done. Charles had gathered Camilla, William, Catherine, and selected relatives to discuss participation in an upcoming summer ceremony. The agenda seemed straightforward, coordinating who would appear where and in what capacity. But the conversation turned when aides proposed expanding ceremonial positions for relatives without defined constitutional duties. And Amelia's honorary designation was specifically included in that proposal. William immediately questioned whether temporary family privileges were slowly becoming permanent expectations. He wasn't objecting to Amelia personally, he was raising a structural question about the future shape of the monarchy and who gets to represent it. But Camilla heard something different beneath his objection. She heard the future king drawing an invisible boundary around his own branch of the family, protecting his children while quietly pushing everyone else further away. William denied that bloodline had anything to do with his concern. He said it was about structure, limits, and avoiding confusion over who actually represents the monarchy. That's a legitimate argument. The royal family has spent decades trying to define who counts as a working royal, precisely because the public gets confused and the institution gets bloated when too many people are floating around with vague ceremonial roles. But then Camilla brought Charlotte, George, and Louis into the discussion, suggesting they were increasingly treated as though no other younger relatives mattered. That changed the temperature of the room instantly. William pushed his chair back slowly and answered with a restraint that Catherine later noted made the room even colder. His children, he said, were not bargaining pieces in arguments about palace stairs. Charles said nothing. That silence from the king in that moment only made the division feel deeper. Camilla left that dinner feeling diminished, and this is where the chain of events really starts to connect. Because later that evening she told a trusted household aide something she never intended for Amelia to hear. She said William was clearing the future court before he even inherits it. That remark, expressed in frustration during a private conversation, was never meant to travel. But according to the documented account that emerged later, that frustration was repeated carelessly days afterward, and the wording changed as it traveled. By the time Amelia overheard a version of it, the message had transformed into something harsher and more definitive. William, she was told, wanted Camilla's family gone when Charles is gone. Not that he was concerned about structure or limits or ceremonial confusion, that he wanted them gone. That's a completely different statement. And Amelia carried those words for weeks until they became resentment. And resentment waited for a target. The target became Charlotte. When you look at the timeline, it's almost too neat, but it's also completely believable because this is how family dysfunction actually works. Private bitterness gets expressed in a moment of frustration. Someone repeats it without thinking. It gets overheard. It gets distorted. And then someone who already feels insecure about their place in the family uses it as a weapon against someone who represents everything they fear losing. Amelia wasn't just angry at Charlotte. She was angry at William. Angry at the future she imagined he was planning. Angry at the fragility of her own position. And Charlotte, who had done nothing to create any of that resentment, became the person she made pay for it. So, by the time William traced the Windsor fight back to the Clarence house dinner, Amelia's punishment stopped being the whole story. The story was now about who let those words escape, who repeated them, and whether Camilla knew her private frustration had been weaponized. When William entered the private sitting room to confront Camilla directly, no aide stood between them. No secretary carried messages. No carefully drafted palace language could soften what had happened. Camilla wanted Amelia's title restored until a family review could be completed. William wanted to know why a young woman from her household had approached his daughter carrying words born inside an adult dispute. Camilla pushed the removal order toward him and accused him of turning one ugly argument into a permanent judgment on Amelia. William told her that was exactly why he had authority to withdraw the designation when conduct crossed the line. He then pointed out that Charlotte had already faced consequences privately for the cruel words she admitted using during the fight. Catherine had made certain their daughter understood that royal protection did not erase personal responsibility. But Amelia had pushed Charlotte, and then repeated confidential claims drawn from adult conversations. Those were separate issues. You can't treat them as equivalent just because both girls said things they regretted. Camilla answered that her granddaughter was now being treated as dangerous, while Charlotte remained shielded by rank, family, and public sympathy. Look, there's a version of this argument that has some validity. Charlotte is the daughter of the future king. She will always have more protection, more sympathy, more institutional weight behind her than Amelia ever will. That imbalance is real and it's not going away. But the problem with Camilla's argument in that moment is that it ignored the specific reason William acted. He didn't strip Amelia's title because she pushed Charlotte. He stripped it because she repeated words that came from an adult in Camilla's orbit. Words that were never meant for her. Words that turned a private family disagreement into ammunition for a confrontation between teenagers. That's not about rank. That's about something toxic entering the environment around his children. And him deciding he wasn't going to allow it to stay. William placed 2 fingers on the removal order and said, "This is staying exactly where it is." The words were quiet, but the message was absolute. Then he produced a documented account and told Camilla that Amelia had repeated phrases traceable directly to the Clarence House dinner. His anger changed shape as he asked whether Camilla had discussed his supposed plans for her family where younger relatives might hear. Camilla hesitated. That hesitation mattered more than any denial could have. She insisted she had never spoken to Amelia about William's intentions, but she admitted venting afterward to a trusted household aide. She remembered the exact frustration she had expressed. And suddenly the distorted words Amelia later carried into the corridor no longer felt mysterious. Her fury gave way to unease, because she realized something she had said in private might have started the chain that ended with Charlotte shaken behind a closed door. Charles entered only after that admission had landed. He expected to find an argument over punishment. Instead, William turned toward his father with one final demand: identify the aide who allowed those words to travel. But the harder question, the one that would define everything that followed, was whether the future king truly had enough authority to make that decision survive the objections of both Charles and Camilla. Palaces rarely announce where power is moving before everyone inside can already feel it. Charles remained king, Camilla remained queen, but the confrontation surrounding Charlotte exposed a reality that had been developing quietly for years. William controlled more of his children's ceremonial environment than many outsiders understood. When Charles finally reviewed the order stripping Amelia's designation, he discovered that overturning it would require more than a father overruling a son. It would require him to openly challenge William's authority over his own household. Charles studied the internal arrangements with his private secretary and quickly saw the structural problem. Amelia's honorary designation had been attached to appearances jointly coordinated with the Prince and Princess of Wales. It functioned as a palace privilege rather than a permanent constitutional entitlement. In practical terms, it gave her access to selected ceremonial duties but did not guarantee her a place in them. William therefore held practical control over whether she appeared beside his children, and reversing that decision would force the king to intervene directly in a way that would be noticed and interpreted as taking sides against his own son and heir. Camilla understood what that meant before anyone explained it to her. She wanted Amelia protected from permanent humiliation, but she also knew that forcing the issue could expose the family division publicly. The queen was caught between protecting a granddaughter she loved and acknowledging that the mechanism of her granddaughter's punishment was legally sound. Charles saw her distress and felt the pressure from both sides. Charlotte had been pulled into an argument built by adults, yet Amelia was now carrying the full weight of a punishment that would be noticed beyond private rooms. Every choice wounded someone. That's not an exaggeration. There was no option where everyone walked away feeling like justice had been served and relationships had been preserved. William made his position clear in a private conversation with his father. He said he would not allow the language of family harmony to become an excuse for keeping hostile tensions around George, Charlotte, or Louis. Charles listened without interrupting. The future king was not asking to control everyone around him. He was drawing a boundary around his children, and that distinction made the decision harder to challenge because it wasn't about power for its own sake. It was about protection. Charles then received the household review, which confirmed that Amelia's designation had always been discretionary and could be withdrawn without parliamentary action or public legal process. More damaging was the aide's statement. In the written testimony, the staff member admitted repeating Camilla's frustrated words during a conversation Amelia later overheard. The missing link was no longer missing. Charles removed his glasses and set the account face down. Camilla asked whether William had been wrong. The king did not answer. His silence carried more weight than any formal ruling. Camilla understood immediately Amelia's title was not coming back. The punishment became real only when Camilla had to say the words herself. Amelia had expected Charles to intervene. She had expected the family to call the fight youthful anger, issue private apologies, and quietly restore everything once tempers cooled. Instead, the queen entered her room without an aide and told her the honorary designation was gone permanently. For the first time since the Windsor confrontation, Amelia stopped defending herself and asked whether the king had chosen Charlotte over her. Camilla did not answer that question immediately. Charles had already decided William's removal order would stand, while Catherine had insisted there would be no public humiliation, no deliberate photograph ban, no retaliatory statement aimed at Amelia. The designation was a ceremonial privilege tied to selected appearances, not a permanent right. Palace platters therefore removed her from 2 summer engagements and reassigned the small duties attached to the role. The change was immediate, and for Amelia, brutally clear. Amelia looked at her grandmother and said she finally understood how fragile her place had always been. She had been encouraged to believe she belonged inside royal life, yet one mistake had been enough to strip away the symbol that made that belonging feel real. That's such a painful realization. And honestly, it speaks to the impossible position that people in Amelia's situation occupy. You're close enough to privilege to feel its pull, but never secure enough to belong completely. You know your position depends on relationships and discretion rather than law or right. And when those relationships become strained, your position evaporates. Camilla felt the accusation, but she didn't fight it. She admitted something harder instead. Amelia had behaved wrongly, but the adults had failed her too. Resentment from the Clarence House dinner had been allowed to travel beyond the room where it began. It was during a private recorded conversation with Camilla that Amelia broke her silence about what happened seconds before the fight turned physical. She had repeated the claim that William wanted her side of the family pushed out. Charlotte had answered, "That isn't what my father said." In that instant, Amelia realized the story she had carried for weeks might have been exaggerated. She pushed the princess anyway. Camilla went still. That admission destroyed the last argument she had been holding on to. The queen could defend a young relative who had been misled. She could not pretend Amelia had acted without choice once doubt had entered her mind. Protecting her no longer meant denying responsibility. Camilla reached toward the dressing table, picked up the small ceremonial pin connected to Amelia's former role, and placed it inside a drawer. Amelia watched her close it, then asked for something nobody expected. She wanted to apologize to Charlotte privately without William, Charles, Camilla, or any palace official in the room. That meeting happened. There were no secretaries, no king, no queen, no future monarch making decisions for either of them. Charlotte and Amelia sat opposite each other with Catherine waiting beyond the closed door, and Camilla deliberately staying away. The conversation was not designed to restore a title or repair an image. It existed to separate what the girls had actually done to each other from the resentment adults had allowed them to inherit. Catherine had agreed to the meeting only after Charlotte asked to hear Amelia herself. The Princess of Wales refused another apology carried through relatives' aides or palace statements, because that would leave the real emotions untouched. William accepted the meeting, but made one condition clear. Forgiveness would not automatically restore the ceremonial consequence. Amelia's former designation had been an honorary privilege, not a permanent right, and the prince wanted responsibility separated from reconciliation. Amelia spoke first. She apologized for pushing Charlotte and for repeating the claim about William wanting Camilla's relatives pushed away from future royal life. Then she admitted the part that hurt more. She had wanted to believe the rumor because Charlotte seemed to possess something she never had, a certainty that she belonged. Jealousy had made the distorted story feel believable long before she had any proof. Charlotte listened without interrupting, then admitted her own cruelty. During the argument, she had told Amelia that a borrowed palace title did not make her royal. The princess said she regretted the sentence almost immediately, even before the confrontation became physical. That admission changed the tone. Neither girl could pretend the other had carried all the blame. Amelia then explained the source in a private recorded account prepared after the meeting. She confirmed that the household aide had repeated the distorted remark within earshot, but had never told her to challenge Charlotte or act on it. There had been no secret order, no planned confrontation, no deliberate trap. Resentment, overheard words, and insecurity had done enough damage on their own. Amelia stopped halfway through another explanation and said something that probably mattered more than anything else in that room. "I was angry at your father, so I made you pay for it." Charlotte stayed silent before answering. That was the part that hurt. The words didn't erase what happened, but they ended the argument neither had known how to end before. Charlotte later told William she accepted the apology but did not want him restoring Amelia's title simply to prove the family was united. The answer surprised him. The girls had reached peace before the adults had, and just as that private anger finally faded, the outside world was about to discover that a royal privilege had disappeared. The palace had managed to keep the fight private. It could not hide an empty place forever. At the next ceremonial engagement, photographers immediately noticed that Amelia was missing from the position she had occupied only weeks earlier. By midday, the change had become the dominant royal story. One image captured the public mood more powerfully than any headline. William leaving the engagement holding Charlotte's hand while Camilla walked several steps behind them, expression fixed, saying nothing. Palace communications moved quickly. A restrained statement confirmed that Amelia no longer held the honorary young royal companion designation, a ceremonial role that had allowed her to appear at selected family events without making her a constitutional member of the monarchy. Officials refused to explain the Windsor altercation. That silence protected both girls, but it also created a vacuum. Broadcasters began linking Amelia's sudden absence with the earlier family gathering, and commentators questioned whether William was becoming far more willing to draw hard boundaries around his children. Camilla feared the story was moving somewhere crueler. She asked Charles privately to prevent aides from leaking details that could turn Amelia into a public villain. She had accepted that the designation was gone, but she would not accept seeing a young relative destroyed for one terrible mistake. The king agreed that the internal accounts should remain sealed and warned his household that protecting Charlotte did not require sacrificing Amelia. William took exactly the same position. He told his communications team that nobody was to brief against Amelia, even anonymously. Charlotte had been hurt, and he had acted to protect her, but he refused to turn public sympathy into revenge. That restraint surprised some around him because the media pressure was now offering him an easy victory. He could have let the narrative run, let Amelia become the villain, let himself look like the protective father drawing a righteous line. He didn't. The story changed again when a national broadcaster described the decision as the clearest demonstration yet that William intends to control the culture surrounding the next generation of royals. Suddenly, the argument was no longer being framed as one fight between two girls. It became a debate about the future king, family boundaries, and what kind of monarchy he intended to shape. Outside Windsor Castle, that debate became impossible to ignore. A small crowd gathered as the family departed. Some called Charlotte's name. Others held newspapers carrying the front page headline about William drawing the line. William kept hold of his daughter's hand, then briefly looked back toward Camilla. She met his gaze. Neither smiled, neither turned away. The headlines made the moment look like William's victory and Camilla's defeat. Inside Windsor, however, the family had already reached a final decision far more complicated than either image suggested. In the end, William did not reverse his decision. Amelia's honorary royal designation remained withdrawn, and Charles did not challenge him. Yet the family also refused to let one violent argument become a lifelong sentence between two young relatives. The final resolution carried no triumphant winner. Charlotte received protection without revenge. Amelia faced a consequence without being banished from the family. Camilla was forced to confront how adult resentment had shaped younger emotions, and William discovered that authority mattered most when he knew where to stop using it. Charles formally closed the internal review and accepted the aide's resignation from duties involving sensitive family conversations. The king also confirmed that Amelia's designation would not be restored. The decision drew a clear line between family membership and ceremonial privilege. Amelia could still attend strictly private gatherings, but she would no longer hold the position that had placed her beside working members of the royal family. Camilla struggled with that distinction at first. The Queen felt William had permanently reduced her side of the family, but a private recorded conversation with Amelia finally changed her thinking. The young woman admitted that restoring the title would make the apology feel meaningless. That confession struck harder than any argument. Camilla understood that protecting someone did not always mean giving back what they had lost. William carried a different fear. He told Catherine privately that seeing Charlotte pulled into adult resentment had frightened him more than the physical fight itself. The Princess of Wales reminded him that protecting their daughter meant more than removing hostile influences. It also meant refusing to let bitterness become something Charlotte inherited from the adults around her. He understood the warning immediately. Camilla later met William without aides present and admitted the Clarence House remark should never have escaped that room. The prince acknowledged that his own language about future boundaries had been colder than necessary. Neither apologized for protecting their families, but both accepted that distrust had turned private frustration into something dangerous. Charlotte provided the real ending days later. At a private family lunch, Amelia quietly asked whether she could sit beside her. The princess moved her chair slightly and made space. There was no dramatic embrace and no instant return to what existed before. There was simply a choice not to keep fighting. That admission destroyed the last argument she had been holding on to. The Queen could defend a young relative who had been misled. She could not pretend Amelia had acted without choice once doubt had entered her mind. Protecting her no longer meant denying responsibility. Camilla reached toward the dressing table, picked up the small ceremonial pin connected to Amelia's former role, and placed it inside a drawer. Amelia watched her close it, then asked for something nobody expected. She wanted to apologize to Charlotte privately without William, Charles, Camilla, or any palace official in the room. That meeting happened. There were no secretaries, no king, no queen, no future monarch making decisions for either of them. Charlotte and Amelia sat opposite each other, with Catherine waiting beyond the closed door, and Camilla deliberately staying away. The conversation was not designed to restore a title or repair an image. It existed to separate what the girls had actually done to each other from the resentment adults had allowed them to inherit. Catherine had agreed to the meeting only after Charlotte asked to hear Amelia herself. The Princess of Wales refused another apology carried through relatives' aides or palace statements, because that would leave the real emotions untouched. William accepted the meeting, but made one condition clear. Forgiveness would not automatically restore the ceremonial consequence. Amelia's former designation had been an honorary privilege, not a permanent right, and the prince wanted responsibility separated from reconciliation. Amelia spoke first. She apologized for pushing Charlotte and for repeating the claim about William wanting Camilla's relatives pushed away from future royal life. Then she admitted the part that hurt more.